Hello, I'm your host, Victor Vogel. Welcome to my podcast this evening. Well, this evening we're going to be talking about the super rich and what they're trying to do in America and how they're trying to control our government. So that ought to be a very interesting topic of discussion. It's very relevant to what's going on right now. So stay tuned. We're going to get into what the super rich is doing to try to control America. Now, as we jump back into the Nixon era, during this period, a significant driver of this secret war was a guy by the name of William Simon. And he served as Secretary of Energy and the Secretary of Treasury under Nixon. And William Simon once said, and this is telling about William, if you really want to help the poor, help the rich. They're the ones who will invest, build more factories, and create more jobs. So you kind of get an idea of where William Simon was coming from. So Simon was a proponent of deregulation, particularly deregulation of the free market. And he was a dedicated libertarian, and he associated with many super rich families, such as the Koch family, whose plots focused on eliminating regulations that impacted the super rich. Today, we know this movement's created the most significant financial inequity in the United States history. So today, in 2022, William Simon's quote has been proven false. Since the early 1900s, the attempt of the super rich to gain control of America's government and institute deregulations is, it's actually failed many times. The people of America and their dissatisfaction with government and their use of their vote thwarted the super rich plots to gain control of the government. In a democracy, every person's vote counts, whether it's rich or not. It's actually weighted equally. There's a multitude of non-rich people compared to the super rich. It became evident that to the rich people of the world that they could not buy our government. They had to develop a plan to control the way people voted. So they developed a secret strategy to gain control of how people vote in America. And it's really interesting and complex and dangerous. Now, they accomplished this by creating foundations that they could funnel large sums of money into, and that money would be tax-free. These foundations were established as really educational foundations, and they're better known as think tanks. They would finance these institutions with tax-deductible grants. That way, they could hire the best thinkers in politics and finance to spend time thinking of ways and developing plans to control the government and implement deregulation and create a free market economy. The genius of this strategy was creating foundations to implement their political purposes and not have to pay any taxes on that money they put into the foundations. Now, the super rich, and let's be clear, this is just a few affluent influencers, families like the Koch family, often met to discuss how often they failed and why they failed. Now, they had tons of money, so they could retain and hire the country's best economic and political minds. Their objective was to develop a plan to destroy democracy without appearing to eliminate democracy. To do this, they must control the majority of votes in America. They created a 3-step battle plan to accomplish the control of American voters. Jane Mayer described the plan in Dark Money, and you can find that on Amazon. Now, the battle plan has to influence voters. They have to control how voters think. Control the people, and you direct the political parties within the government. Perhaps that's why Koch termed this plan the structure of social change. This is more than just saving taxes. It's a plan designed to alter society as we know it in America. Phase 1. Now, the first phase of the plan includes infusing libertarian values of those times into America's educational system. They started with elite universities. This would be accomplished by selecting and placing the hand-picked individuals that they've hired, those intellectuals who supported the libertarian view in colleges, to establish and teach classes that support a free market mentality in the government. The libertarians had learned that they could not openly approach liberal colleges about changing their curriculum to teach free market conservative values. Such programs would meet with resistance from the beginning. They began slowly with universities like Harvard that were perceived as prestigious schools, and they gave them a lot of money and donations also. They referred to this as establishing beachheads to spread their strategy to other schools. As Jane Mayer mentions in her book, for them to accomplish this, the formula required subtlety and a little indirection and perhaps even some misdirection. It didn't take long for this tactic to spread to other schools throughout the country. And this phase is continuing currently. Phase 1 is the super rich's investment in the intellectual talent that will be needed for the institutional change. The second phase involves investing in the development of think tanks. Think tanks would use the trained intellectuals to create the action plans to control and ensure the votes needed to influence government. It wasn't realistic to believe a libertarian could win most of the Congress during those days. What was required were convert actions to elect Republicans, that would be the conservative party, and infuse the Republican Party with candidates who could strongly be influenced by the super rich. To accomplish this, Phase 2, covertly, is a complicated task. It requires hiding large sums of money used to control voting in America. To achieve this type of control requires finding a way to contribute to campaigns from the federal level through the local groups where voting takes place. Groups like the Heritage Foundation and other highly conservative think tanks were established. The super rich continued to meet and adjust to external factors affecting their plan. Again, these foundations operate under a privacy code. You don't know who is contributing what. And they operated either as an educational or a social work foundation. Yet, all the time, their work is focused on establishing a government that supports their objective of eliminating government regulation and creating a government based on a free market society, not so much a democracy. There are many books and articles written about these foundations and their work. It should be noted there are foundations that support democracy and a balanced government, like the Ford Foundation strongly supported a lot of social programs. What is essential to understand is there are super rich cabals, people who are scheming, funding foundations with the intent to eventually subvert our democratic government while avoiding billions of dollars of tax-free money to support the design of programs to achieve their objectives. In other words, they're not paying a dime because they're contributing to educational and social work foundations that aren't supposed to necessarily be focused on voter registration or anything having to do with elections. However, because they are training people in these systems in these foundations that in universities that these foundations support, they're training these people in the concepts of free market, libertarian values, so that they will then be able to be infused into the Republican Party, and therefore, if they gain control through the Republican Party, they will then have the ability to control those people financially by their contributions, and we'll talk about how that happens in Phase 3 coming up. Phase 3. Phase 3 is where all of the action plans happen. This is where everything gets put into gear that's been created by the intellectuals hired in Phase 1 and trained in Phase 2, and now they're infused into where they need to be to begin to start the action plans to make their plan come to fruition. So the third phase of this plan is aimed squarely at the local levels of American society. It has its sight on voters. This is where they have the best chance of impacting Republican politicians. Koch best described what come to be known as the Kochtopus plan this way. He said, to bring about social change requires a strategy that is vertically and horizontally integrated. It must span from idea creation, which is Phase 1, to policy development, which is Phase 2, to education, to grassroots organization, to lobbying, to political action, and that's Phase 3. In Phase 3, the most challenging of the phases to finance, since there are obstacles like campaign laws. This is where social change has to happen to cope with democracy. Each American gets one vote. It becomes essential to control the vote at the local level. All the money spent on educating intellectuals about social change and establishing think tanks to create policies that culminates at the grassroots level, where change takes place. On average, middle-class people hate the rich and dislike the government. They see the rich and government at odds with their best interest. It has been Koch's family objective for decades to bridge that gap. David Koch described his goals clearly. My overall concept is to minimize the role of government and to maximize the role of the private economy and to maximize personal freedoms. Today, in 2022, the underlying theme connecting all the radical right groups pushing the Republican Party is personal freedom. You find this during shouting matches over mask wearing in schools. It was all over signs and trucks during the Canadian trucker protests. Some were Canadians, some were not Canadians, some we don't know who they were. During debates about CRT and book banning, personal freedom is significant. Militias tout personal freedom as their main reason for resisting government controls. When the Koch first started pushing their libertarian views to the Republican Party, it became apparent to Koch that the libertarian philosophy was way too far to the right for the Republican Party, and too right to the radical part of that party. So they were even beyond that. To execute social change, they would have to adjust to and then gain control of the Republican Party. This required finding ways to inject the philosophy of minimal government into the ranks of the Republicans at all levels. Keep in mind, this was happening in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. David Koch described his goals clearly. My overall concept is to minimize the role of government and to maximize the role of the private economy and to maximize personal freedoms. The Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court unleashed the controls limiting campaign contributions. The financial structure was in place to develop foundations that focused on educating the population and establishing the premise that it was the wealthy who could best serve the interest of Americans, not the government. The rich provided jobs, wages, and benefits to workers. Their philosophy was clear. Don't provide welfare to those who don't or can't work because it takes away their incentive to work and they can't achieve their self-respect. If you aren't working, you lose your self-respect. You have to have a purpose, and working for the super rich provides that purpose. That's generally their philosophy. Indeed, work offers these benefits. However, the rich benefit far greater than the worker. And we saw how the pandemic caused people to begin to rebel against that. And we saw corporations and companies, both large and small, all over the place, begin to raise the minimum wage to $15, something Congress couldn't do. The purpose of these programs, the ones offered by the super rich, really are self-serving for the super rich. The rich believe freedom and independence came from financial success. In the eyes of the rich, freedom means the strong are free, the weak are helpless, and don't deserve freedom. I might be over-exaggerating a little bit, but it's going down that line. Why should those who work hard provide for those who don't work? That's always an argument that comes out of these groups. Programs like Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, child tax credits, and other programs derived from the taxes collected in America really should just be abolished. We saw these attacks happening under the Trump administration. Their primary goal was to repeal everything Obama did, but most particularly the Obamacare program, the Affordable Care Act. This health insurance program allowed millions of poor people to acquire insurance they could not afford before the act was passed. It nearly succeeded, except for the single vote of John McCain. In 2017, though, a new tax bill was passed by the Republicans that touted the reduction in taxes for everyone. Now, that bill's been in existence for 5 years. Analysis of the bill clearly shows it cost middle-class Americans, from a tax perspective, or something they're going to have to pay in the future, trillions of dollars of debt. It allowed the super rich to gain billions of dollars in savings. For most Americans, if you looked into their taxes, really dug into them, and divided what those tax benefits were to them, if they got any, and divided it by 2,080 hours a week that is a normal work week, you probably saved enough money to buy a cup of coffee at a 7-Eleven, not a Starbucks, but a 7-Eleven, once a day for a year. Financial inequity grew even wider during the Republican administration from 2016 to 2020. We saw that constantly. It was part of the campaign that came out of Bernie Sanders and also Joe Biden. And in fact, every Democratic candidate agreed on that. The top 1% benefited greatly during the Trump years. The COVID-19 pandemic brought all this into light. People began to see the real financial inequity between the super rich and themselves. Now, having worked their way into the Republican Party during the 2016 campaign, the Koch and the super rich claimed a real victory in 2016. Once again, though, they failed to deliver on nearly all their promises that the Republicans and Trump made to those who voted for him. Yet they grew richer many times over under the Trump administration. People were growing weary of Trump's failures and his public image. Much to the Koch's disappointment, Trump had begun to exhibit questionable behaviors, if not illegal behaviors. President Trump was impeached over the Ukraine debacle. Republicans failed to convict him, but it was not a unanimous vote. Trump was acting more like a dictator than a president of a democracy, or even the way Charles and David Koch would like him to behave. During his presidency, Trump was rallying his supporters in public. He continued to harp on old issues like Hillary Clinton, even though he'd won the election. Trump kept making bold promises everyone knew he could not control or keep. Mexico would pay for the southern border wall, which was never completed, and Mexico was never going to pay for it. That was obvious. During this time, he was aggravating women and suburban voters. The press reported the number of blatant lies Trump was making in public and on tweets. They get thousands. Trump ultimately was banned from Twitter and Facebook for providing misinformation. Groups supported Trump regardless of his lies, personal behavior, and failure to deliver the promises. The radical right groups, evangelicals, militias, white supremacists, and radical right Republicans praised Trump regardless of his behavior and regardless of obvious facts right in front of us. In Phase 2, the intellectuals hired during Phase 1 worked feverishly through the years working within the super-rich foundations to create strategies that would work on two categories of Americans: the radical right and the middle-class America. These two groups require different approaches to be manipulated. Combined, they were designed to deliver the results of gaining control of government. The Koch family and the super-rich, that were the libertarians, were primarily a white society. In fact, I can't think of many during those early days that were people of color. I'm sure there may have been some, but they weren't part of this super-rich cabal, the Koch inner circle. They all had a racist focus on life. Racism was accepted during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. It's pretty evident. You can go back and see all that transpired then. Trump's administration rallied groups who felt their freedom was threatened by minorities. You just go back and look at his speeches. You can see this. The radical right was predominantly white. They felt that their race was being threatened by an ever-growing minority community, people of color, black people, immigrants crossing the southern border, the Middle East immigrants. These radical groups consisted of white supremacist groups and right-wing evangelical religions. The beliefs of these two groups intersect. The radical right evangelical churches are very strict, contradictory, and exclusionary of other faiths. They don't align with their strict interpretation of the Bible. For example, the Jewish and Catholic religions are considerably different. In fact, the Jewish religion doesn't even believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. Twistedly, the white supremacist believes anyone not born as a pure white, whatever that definition is, and I'm having a hard time struggling with finding that out, but they should not be allowed the same rights as purebred white people. And that's a pretty coarse way of saying it, but that is basically their thinking. In addition to all people of color, it would also include people from the Jewish race. Militias are not really focused as much on race, although they're primarily a white group, but they're not focused on racism and race as their issue. They're primarily concerned with personal freedom. They want to be freed of all government regulation, taxes, gun control, civil rights, and other government regulations. These super-rich cabals recognize Trump's cult-like following. Radical groups constitute a significant voting population. They are a cult for all intents and purposes, and their cult leader is Donald Trump. When Donald Trump lost the presidency, the House and the Senate, he took his cult population and maintained control over them. He has created a split in the conservative Republican Party, something the Kochs and the super-rich didn't anticipate. Once again, the plans to take over the government were dashed by Joe Biden's significant win in 2020. The vast majority of the radical right cult following voted for Trump and were stunned and in disbelief that he lost. This led to the big steel lie that the election was fraudulent. This lie has been disproven multiple times through state and federal courts, but Trump and his following continue to push that lie. That's how he can justify his loss. This has widened the gap between the conservative Republicans and Trump supporters, something that the super rich and the Koch family had not counted on. Once again, they were struggling to maintain control. Middle-class America mainly voted for Joe Biden in the federal election. However, they voted many Republicans back into office or replaced Democrats with Republicans in state and local elections. The middle class is still fence-sitting. They dislike a lot about Donald Trump, but are not sold on the full Democratic agenda. They're confused and frustrated with both parties infighting. They are one of the most desired targets of the Koch and the super rich because of their ability to swing elections. The radical right groups have been unduly influenced and are tightly aligned with Donald Trump, and because of their cult-like environment, they are less likely to change their minds about anything. On the other hand, the middle class is more open to ideas and change than ever before. The middle class and those not affiliated with Trump's cult are open to education and learning to determine what is best for them and America during this time of strong division. The super rich strategy for the middle class is much different from the Trump followers. The middle class tends to be more educated and responds to dialogue and logic more than emotion. Things like congruity, consistency, compassion, and competence build trust and matter to the middle class. They are intelligent and they can evaluate platforms and determine the impact on their lives and America as a democracy. The middle class belief in democracy stirred them to vote for democracy versus autocracy in 2020. The middle class often view religion from the eyes of Christ. Love your neighbor as you love yourself, and aren't exclusionary of race or religious beliefs as much as the radical rights. They are a more inclusive class. In addition, the younger population in this class tends to support social programs. This has proven to be the downfall for Koch and the super rich efforts over the years. It's also a strong target for them to focus on in upcoming years. The primary objective of the super rich is to eliminate all government control, enhance their wealth, and allow them to behave any way they wish. It is the middle class fence sitters that are the most significant blockade to the super rich takeover of the government. Their strategy is to convince this group that the best approach to achieving their goal is wealth. They also want this segment of society to believe the best way to help others in need is by allowing the super rich to provide through capitalism without controls. The problem continues to be the super rich have failed to provide for the middle class. Financial inequity is greater now than ever in history, something the super rich want to minimize in the eyes of the middle class fence sitters. To cope with this problem, super rich, still led by the Koch family, are focusing their foundations on developing education programs in colleges and high school that infuse the theory of economics into children and young adults. This is a long-term approach and could take years. The wealthy need short-term strategies to win in the 2022 and 2024 elections to dominate Republicans, so their super rich can control and implement their plan of less government control. This requires psychological warfare campaigns targeting the middle-class value system and using the radical right as the enforcement arm. Koch and the rich use their foundations to attract and educate the radical right and considered middle class through misinformation and disinformation campaigns. Why disinformation and misinformation? Because the truth is born from facts, and facts are on the side of moderate Democrats. Even with party dissension, Biden and the Democrats have delivered more results in 1 year than Trump and the Republicans delivered in 4 years, or the Republicans in the last 3 decades. Biden and his team have done this with total Republican obstructionism while fighting a pandemic. They divert answers through misinformation and disinformation when Republicans are asked what they have delivered or what their platform is. I can't find it. Why? Because the Republican Party is shredded and flawed with corruption up into congressional representation. Something the Koch brothers didn't count on. One issue links the middle-class fence-sitters and the radical right, which is the concept of freedom. This is the focal attack point of the super-rich strategy. So what does this attack look like? For the radical right, the government intrudes on people's right to do what they want and live the way they want. For religion, it is about things like prayer in schools being eliminated. It is about Muslims in Congress, or about the threat of removing tax-free status of preachers. Other issues are abortion, LGBTQ rights, and other discrimination laws. These personal freedoms issues are the same for white supremacists and militias. They are core value beliefs and aren't things that education will alter or change in the short term. They are, however, emotional issues that quickly will get people angry and often are not resolved by logic or dialogue. These groups are most susceptible to misinformation and disinformation to the point of denial, despite undeniable facts disproving the information. The super-rich strategy is to use these people to stir hate and discontent. They will fund and provide education for disrupting school board meetings. They will provide information about how to disseminate disinformation, create violence, use the threat of violence and intimidation to keep people from voting. We see this in threats to teachers, school board members, election officials, nurses, and politicians. Many of these threats come from out of state, and some have been tied to foreign actors like Russians. These radical right groups use rallies, protests, social media, media networks, posters, signs, t-shirts, ball caps, and sometimes tattoos on their body to deliver their threatening misinformation and messages. All of this is funded and organized from a central source. Leaflets and door hangers with swastika signs on them are left at people's homes. The radical right groups are primed for this type of indoctrination. They are emotionally driven, focused, and susceptible to being unduly influenced by brainwashing. However, this only works to a point. Americans react negatively to this intimidation and threat. They are resisting many of these groups' anti-everything approach. We've seen this in everything from masking during the pandemic to people becoming fed up with the Canada truck protesters disrupting their lives. Americans are discovering that these radical groups are funded from outside sources, dark money with deep pockets, contributions to the Canadian truck protesters, many of whom were not Canadian or even truck drivers. These groups were supported by social media funding sites like GoFundMe, which shut down their distribution of funds. And now they're being tracked by the Canadian government to find out what the real sources of income were for those groups. For the middle class, there's more of a logical and intellectual approach to misinformation and distortion for all of those middle class fence-sitters. Foundations have backed groups questioning education, like CRT in schools. This was an important topic that turned to race in Virginia. CRT arose quickly in Virginia, even though it was clearly demonstrated that in K through 12 schools, CRT was not even being taught. Freedom is now used in propaganda to the point that individual parents should have a right to determine school curriculums. Laws are being passed to support vigilante policing of teachers in the classrooms, using video cameras, something straight out of George Orwell's 1984 novel. Gerrymandering of districts and voter suppression laws are part of this strategy to control the local voting. All of these have an element of minimizing minority voters, which ties to the radical right agendas. An extreme amount of money is funneled into PACs and foundations, often traced back to the super rich. Heading the list is the Koch family. For over 3/4 of a century, there has been a laser-specific focus to eliminate and control the United States government by America's extravagantly wealthy. This is a tiny group of people, less than 1% of our total population. To be abundantly clear, this is not every super rich person in America. It is enough of the super rich category to constitute a significant threat to our democracy. Their primary purpose is to deregulate the government to favor the wealthy's ability to become even richer. Their efforts have been thwarted by the American people time after time through the effectiveness of our democracy. This has not dampened the super rich's motivation. The conspiracies have become intent on destroying democracy and turning America into an autocratic capitalistic country. Many things have gotten in the way of their objectives. World wars have halted their efforts. America's diversification has been a thorn in their side. The most significant deterrent is each American's right to vote for representatives in our government. Financial inequity is a principle that the super rich believe in and want to amplify in America. It is the way the wealthy can maintain their wealth and power and control over the middle class. The people have learned from their failures. They are constantly refining their strategies to overcome democracy. At this point in time, they have decided to use lies, deceit, misinformation, disinformation, threats, intimidation, and violence. They are exceptionally well funded and have funneled their money into foundations and made those foundations appear to support democracy through contribution to causes they disagreed with all of their lives. They were unable to win elections and convert our country as libertarians. These super rich people have elected now to exploit the Republican Party, deceive Americans, and infect our society with disinformation and misinformation to keep it divided. Democracy will fail if the people remain divided. It nearly worked in 2016. The people saw the results. A highly divided country led to an insurrection to prevent a legal and well-run election in 2020. In 2022 through 2024, this threat to America will infuse more dark money into campaigns than any time in history. The only thing between them and our freedom as a country and democracy is your vote. I'm Victor Vogel. This is my podcast, my opinions only, and represent no one else or any other entity's opinions. They are opinions, but you can open your eyes and see for yourself. Until the next podcast, I'm Victor Vogel. Have a great day.